welcome to the third edition of Open Court with MJ Akbar. Mr. Akbar requires no introduction, public intellectual, writer, Rajya Sabha MP, and a former Minister of External Affairs. Today, we will be discussing 50 years of Bangladesh liberation and the way forward. I'm joined by Ratna Shukla Anand. Mr. Akbar, if we could throw back 50 years ago on the situation in Bangladesh, do you think that the liberation of Bangladesh in some way was inevitable, or it was the grounds existed which were exploited by all sides to make it happen?
That the liberation of Bangladesh happened 50 years ago in the period of 1971, which is technically true, but actually the foundations of a separate nation were laid within 1 year of the creation of Pakistan. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who created the doctrine of Pakistan and got this new country out of the partition of India with the help of the British, went to Dhaka within less than a year of independence. And there in Dhaka, he made the startling and rather injudicious, to put it mildly, comment that Bengali would not be treated as a national language. This shocked the people of Bangladesh, who, for them, Bengali had a cultural power, a cultural reality, which they were not willing to forsake. And from that public, when Jinnah made the assertion that, Urdu represented patriotism, and nobody could understand it. Look at it in our country. In our country, we have, of course, our national language. We are proud of it, which is Hindi. But we also have 26, I think, other languages which have equal acceptance, which are part of the cultural depth of our nation. But Jinnah, by abandoning that, really, and you can see that the Awami League movement actually begins to take momentum from there, and you can see that the oppression and suppression, which peaked in 1970 and then, of course, turned into a tragic genocide in 71. But the oppression was a constant factor in the life of the father of Bangladesh, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. The reason, of course, if you will give me another minute, is because the doctrine of Pakistan was deeply flawed. It was based on an assumption, I can't call it anything more than that Islam was sufficient as a basis for nationalism. Now, there is no record of this in the history of Muslims. Islam is a brotherhood. It is not a nationhood. Indeed, if Islam was sufficient as a basis of a nation, why would there be so many Arab countries? But the flaw of this doctrine is evident all over. If the brotherhood, if it has a capital, then it is the place of Hajj, which is Makkah Sharif. But Mecca has never been the capital of a Muslim nation state. Medina was the first capital, and today it is Riyadh of Saudi Arabia. So the history of Muslims has enough evidence that the two are different, and indeed, as that is perfectly rational, and therefore the idea of Pakistan itself was spurious.
Do you think that there was this combination of factors? One, what was happening inside Bangladesh, which was primary, and the role of India, along with that of the former Soviet Union, the planning which went ahead for the liberation war. Do you think this was a perfect sort of a match which leveraged the insurrection in a way which was taking place in Bangladesh?
No, I think we must be very clear that we must not confuse cause and consequence. The cause lay in the idea of Pakistan and its inability to hold the nation together. The Bangladesh liberation movement began, in a sense, with Sheikh Mujib's six-point program. Now, six-point program was around the time, of the elections, the only real free elections that Pakistan had had till then, which was in 1970, where the Awami League astounded its own supporters, if you like, and shocked its opponents by getting a majority in the assembly. And after they had won a majority, the powers that be, the military powers that be, the bureaucratic powers that be, the political powers that be in West Pakistan, the political powers led by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, they actually moved in to deny the inevitable logic of a genuine general election, which was to let the party which had a majority form the government, because they came to this absurd conclusion that this party could not be trusted with patriotism. Now, it is out of this deep sense of betrayal that the last stage of the Bangladesh liberation struggle came to the fore. Then I think the talks between General Yahya Khan and Sheikh Mujibur Rahman collapsed on 25th March, by which time the Western military, bureaucratic, political alliance had convinced itself that the only option was obnoxious suppression of this liberation struggle, and therefore the Awami leadership, much of it, had to take shelter somewhere else. Sheikh Mujib was arrested, but before he was arrested, he drafted and proclaimed the independence of his country, which was then broadcast the next day and the following day and the day after that, and on radio. And from there emerged and on 25th, the night of 25th, Pakistan began what was called Operation Searchlight, where it wasn't Operation Searchlight, it was Operation Genocide. And that involved killing hundreds of thousands, I mean, countless, literally countless numbers, and creating such havoc and such terror that Bangladeshis fled to the neighboring areas, which is our country, India, to seek protection, which Mrs. Gandhi, Indira Gandhi, who led the country brilliantly at that time, she provided that sanctuary. She pleaded with the rest of the world. She actually visited the rest of the world to plead with them to help with this humanitarian crisis. The rest of the world remained indifferent. And then in December, Pakistan provoked a full-scale war by attacking our airfields from the West. So it was Pakistan which actually provoked the war. And of course, once the war started, our planning for such an eventuality, led by General Manekshaw, was again superb. We ended the war in less than 2 weeks. We entered Dhaka, we surrounded it, and General Niazi, the leader of the Pakistan Armed Forces, Pakistan Army in there, actually he still had 93,000 troops, 92,000 troops fully armed, and he surrendered abjectly.
How important was Soviet Union as a factor in the liberation of Bangladesh?
The Soviet Union had an alliance with us, which was a friendship alliance, and which basically reinforced a relationship which had been growing for some time. And it had a security implication because through the treaty, the Soviets had to come to the help of India, were required by the treaty. But I think the most important thing that the Soviets did was not in the area of the battlefield, but in United Nations. And in the United Nations, when the Americans were trying desperately to try and get a ceasefire before the Pakistanis surrendered, that was the aim. They knew that Pakistan had been defeated. Within 48 hours or 72 hours, we had smashed the Pakistan Navy with a brilliant operation from Mumbai up to Karachi, and then again by sinking the INS, by sinking Ghazi, the submarine in the Bay of Bengal, and then within 48 hours, our Air Force had neutralized Pakistan Air Force. in what was then East Pakistan. And then when the infantry moved, it moved at a speed which was beyond the imagination of the watching world. And of course, the only option that America and the Pakistan leadership had was to somehow force a ceasefire upon India before the complete surrender of the Pakistan army in Dhaka, and that the Russians and the East European, what would be the Warsaw Bloc countries, helped many of them cooperated and helped us to stave it off until uh, General Manekshaw and General Arora and General Jacob, who was very instrumental in the planning of the war, could order Niazi to sign on the dotted line.
I was just wondering, is Bangladesh really, in historical terms, it set a precedent? Because you find the similar, not the same, but oppression which is taking place in other geographies of present-day Pakistan, especially when you see Balochistan, there is a struggle which is going on. There are you have BLA and several other resistance groups which have come up. Do you think this has set a precedent?
The struggle in Balochistan is more evidence that that Pakistan cannot be held together just in the name of religion. That is its primary message, and that there has to be a very different kind of approach, a very different kind of constitutional honesty, if you like, in Pakistan for it to survive as a nation. But the Balochistan struggle has now gone so far that serious, I think, perhaps even legitimate suspicions have arisen about Pakistan's ability to hold that geography within its fold.
How central geographically located Bangladesh is to India's connectivity and its outreach to Southeast Asia? In other words, how important is Bangladesh to India's Act East policy?
Look, Bangladesh is extremely and vitally important friend for us, not because it is a conduit to something larger, but primarily because we two nations together actually offer proof of what neighboring countries, how neighboring countries should behave. The cooperation that has developed, particularly under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi and Sheikh Hasina, is actually, if you compare it to the relationship that India has toward its neighbor in the West, is evidence that with goodwill, good intentions, and a common desire for peaceful resolution of problems, what dramatic things can be achieved. People forget that one of the oldest border problems we had was with East Pakistan. That there was a disputed area which had simply not been resolved since independence. But under Prime Minister Modi and under Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, who is of course the father of the nation's daughter, they actually resolved it peacefully through the will of the people as expressed by the two parliaments. The goodwill generated by this decision cannot be measured. But now that Dhaka and Delhi are using the policy of peaceful resolution, right? This doesn't mean that all differences have disappeared. They never will disappear. What it does mean is that you can work together as friends, irrespective of differences. In fact, you can melt the differences in the warmth of peace.
अकबर साहब, मैं ये जानूंगी कि पिछले कुछ दिनों में जिस तरह से हमने देखा कि बांग्लादेश में सीए एनआरसी का विरोध हुआ, बीआरआई के साथ जो है, जो चाइना का जो बीआरआई है उसमें बांग्लादेश का इन्वॉल्वमेंट है, तो आगे कहीं जाकर ऐसा लगता है कि बांग्लादेश भारत के लिए थ्रेट हो सकता है?
जी नहीं, देखिए, मैंने आपको कहा कि समस्याएं कोई ऐसा कोई ऐसा पार्टनरशिप नहीं है, कोई ऐसा संबंध नहीं है इतिहास में जब दो देशों में कोई किस्म का डिफरेंस या प्रॉब्लम, समस्या ना हो। समस्या रहेंगी, अपनी अपनी सोच होती है, अपना अपना नज़रिया होता है, तो ये फ़र्क रहेंगे। लेकिन ये देखना है कि आप फ़र्क को क्राइसिस बना रहे हैं या फ़र्क को आप, जैसे मैंने कहा, दोस्ती में कम कर रहे हैं। यही है। और हमने देखा है कि हाँ, जब एक दूसरे से दो देश, दो नेता हाथ मिलाते हैं तो दोनों हाथों में फिर वो और दोनों दिलों में वो एक इच्छा होती है कि चलिए हम दूरियां कितनी तेजी से नजदीकियां बनाते हैं।
भी कल्चरल, हिस्टोरिकल, लिंग्विस्टिक जो सिमिलैरिटीज़ हैं वो कहीं न कहीं हमारे संबंधों को मज़बूत बनाने के लिए बहुत ही एक महत्वपूर्ण और बहुत ही पुख्ता आधार हैं। लेकिन रेडिकल फोर्सेस भी जैसे बढ़ रही हैं, तो वो चिंता का विषय है क्या भारत के लिए?
देखिए, जो हम कल्चरल भी आपने कहा अभी, जो एक कल्चरल एक सिमिलैरिटीज़ हैं है, उसको भी हम एक ज़रा सा धैर्य से, ज़रा सा लॉजिक से समझना चाहिए। ये हमें एक नहीं बना देता है। वो एक अलग मुल्क है, वो एक इंडिपेंडेंट मुल्क है और वो अपनी इंडिपेंडेंट ट्रैजेक्टरी से ही मूव करेगा। हाँ, बांग्ला यहाँ पर भी बोली जाती है, बांग्ला वहाँ पर भी बोली जाती है, लेकिन भाषा में अंतर भी है और जो भी हो, लेकिन वो अपनी कल्चर में ही बांग्लादेश आगे बढ़ेगा और हम अपनी कल्चर में हम आगे बढ़ेंगे। तो ये बातें जो हैं हमें ज़रा सा सोच के, ज़रा सा एक पेशेंस के साथ और धैर्य के साथ इसके ऊपर विचार करना चाहिए। हाँ, जहाँ पर आपने रेडिकलिज्म की बात की, वो समस्या हमारे यहाँ है, लेकिन ये मैं मानता हूँ कि शायद हमारे यहाँ सबसे कम है। जो भी है, वैसे रेडिकल फोर्सेस हैं और बांग्लादेश में हैं, और बांग्लादेश में जो रेडिकल फोर्सेस हैं वो बांग्लादेश को तंग करेंगी। और मुल्कों में भी शायद आप जिस तरफ देखिए, कहीं ना कहीं अक्सर मुल्कों में, काफ़ी मुल्कों में रेडिकल फोर्सेस एक समस्या बन चुके हैं और बन रहे हैं। बांग्लादेश में कभी इनका टेम्परेचर ऊपर जाता है, कभी घट के ही नीचे आता है, लेकिन वहाँ की सरकार भी समझती है। और हम एक पड़ोसी देश और एक सिर्फ पड़ोसी नहीं, हम एक हमदर्द देश और एक सहायक देश होने के नाते हमें दोनों मिलकर इस रेडिकलिज्म को कैसे ख़त्म करें, और ख़ास तौर पे इस रेडिकलिज्म का जो एक बहुत ही डेंजरस और भयानक अंग है, जो है टेररिज्म, उसको हम मिलकर कैसे ख़त्म करें। यही हमारी रणनीति है, यही हमारी रणनीति होनी चाहिए। और मैं बुलंदी के साथ कह सकता हूँ कि ये अभी हो रहा है, दोनों मुल्क में काफ़ी कोऑपरेशन।
From what you said just now, I mean, do you think we need to reinforce emotional connectivity? And if so, how would you broadly strategize that to happen?
Look, emotional connectivity is something which the people determine, not governments. Right? The governments determine political policy connectivity. The people, and how does emotional connectivity come? It comes through the simplest of measures, which is travel. Today, in normal times, I'm not talking about these COVID or pandemic times, the largest number of visas that are issued at our Benapole border between the two Bengals. Now, people, and if you actually go to the Benapole border, you will see how civilized that border is. You go there, and in 15-20 minutes, you're through. There is no problem. Your luggage goes into security, and you go through. You walk across the barrier, and you're on the other side. I have always maintained that a neighbor should be determined not by geography but by reach. How quickly can you reach a neighbor? And with Bangladesh, it's definitely reaching a friend's home, not into hostile territory. And that is as it should be.
साहब, चाइना का जितना इन्फ्लुएंस बढ़ रहा है बांग्लादेश में, बांग्लादेश की स्ट्रेटेजिक लोकेशन इस तरह से है कि बे ऑफ बंगाल है, अरेबियन सी है, वहाँ पे भी अपना प्रभुत्व को बढ़ाना चाहता है चाइना। आपको लगता है कि भारत के लिए ये एक मुश्किल पैदा कर सकता है?
नहीं, क्यों भारत के लिए मुश्किल पैदा करेगा? हम जहाँ पे समझते हैं कि हमारे इंटरेस्ट में कुछ खलल आ रहा है या हमारे इंटरेस्ट को चैलेंज किया जाता है, तो हम एक दोस्त के नाते एक दूसरे से खुल के बात करते हैं, खुलासा करते हैं। और जब हम खुलासा करते हैं और हमारे बात में अगर वज़न होता है, जो है जब भी हम करते हैं तो हम वज़न के साथ करते हैं, तो हमारे दोस्त इस बात को, मित्र हमारे, समझ लेते हैं। और जब समझ लेते हैं तो फिर अगर करेक्शंस कुछ चाहिए या करेक्टिव्स कुछ चाहिए तो वो भी हो जाते हैं। लेकिन ये समझना कि बांग्लादेश का चीन के साथ कोई संबंध नहीं होगा, ये तो मेरे ख्याल हिमाकत है।
थैंक यू सर।
थैंक यू।